Back in 2004, people thought that 6 years were an astoundingly long amount of time for the sequel to the award-winning Half-Life 1 to be released. Now that Half-Life 2 is no longer a minor, and now that Half-Life 1 is almost as old as me, every Half-Life fan is left wondering if Half-Life 3 would ever come out. Sure, we got Half-Life Alyx, but the fact that it's VR left a lot of people out from having fun with it, me included. I need to remark though that publishing a game entirely centered around the character of Alyx suggests us that Valve was and probably still is quite confused on which path the Half-Life series needs to embark on. In my opinion, this confusion was already apparent from the big set and setting shift that occurred between Half-Life 1 and Half-Life 2. In fact, from escaping an underground facility located in the United States, in New Mexico to be precise, in the sequel we are brought by train in an Eastern European city which represents the complete opposite of what good old America stands for. Now I would like to take a moment and revise with you some words coming out of the writers of Half-Life 1 and Half-Life 2. It's none other than Mark Laidlaw in an interview from 2010, where he talks about how hard it was to find a way to connect the Half-Life 1 plot with Half-Life 2, while adding how Valve wanted Half-Life 2 to build a completely new world and experience for the players. So our first task for Half-Life 2 was to create a new world that shared enough elements with the first to flow from it logically. And again, it was very difficult to find a way to connect the two. We wanted the second game to be another world, a completely new experience. We nuked Black Mesa because we did not want to give ourselves the easy way out to go back there for the sequel. So this would explain the huge gap between the first and second entry in the series. However, Laidlaw elucidates how another issue was to still establish some form of connection with the two games, and the answer was to reintroduce the science team from Half-Life 1. And in fact, in the first 30 minutes of Half-Life 2, we meet Kleiner, Eli Vance, Barney, and the new addition to the party, Alyx Vance. Here's the quote from the interview. The key, finally, was characters. Once we realized that our random set of Half-Life 2 characters could actually be the surviving science team from Black Mesa, we were able to reinvent everything else. It was the best possible way for linking the games. My problem with this way of connecting the two games is that Half-Life 1 characters were quite anonymous. You wouldn't know who Eli Vance or Kleiner were, because many scientists share the same model, nor they ever introduce themselves through their official names. In addition to this, Laidlaw justifies the bigger focus on characters in Half-Life 2, where Gordon is in fact surrounded by friends, fake friends and enemies, by stating that Valve was investing a lot in facial rendering technologies. And indeed, Half-Life 2's characters' models and faces still hold up to this day, while this does not really apply to other games from that same era. Take Far Cry or Doom 3 as an example, they all look plastic. In another interview, Laidlaw acknowledges again the huge leap that occurred from Half-Life 1 to Half-Life 2, specifically explaining how from saving the world as a single powerful individual such as Freeman himself, in Half-Life 2 the goals of larger groups were taken more into consideration. This statement definitely applies to Half-Life 2, where Gordon is constantly bossed around by the science team and Alyx, as if he did not manage to escape Black Mesa all by himself. But why am I stressing so much about the change in set and setting and about the bigger focus on character stories and emotions taking place in Half-Life 2? Because I believe these are the main two reasons why we never got Half-Life 3, along with a tendency by Valve to always wanting to innovate on what they have previously done. Instead of Half-Life 3, in fact, we got an apparently great VR game instead. So let's tackle the set and setting change first. We all know that in Half-Life 1, the entirety of the game takes place in the interior and exterior areas of Black Mesa, with 3 final chapters in Xen. Half-Life 1 truly is an amazingly tight adventure, and the same Laidlaw praises the Half-Life series for its cohesiveness. What Half-Life arguably has is a sense of cohesiveness. Then the writer goes on now, Mark focuses on this almost indescribable sense of whole and feeling of individuality. And Half-Life 1 is indeed cohesive, because aside from thoroughly exploring Black Mesa, you actually get to explore the alien place you catch a glimpse of during the Resonance Cascade, and from which all the different alien species you happily slaughter during your journey come from. And Xen is a mysterious yet alluring place where you even get to fight the final boss, arguably one of the weirdest looking bosses in video game history. Half-Life 2 instead, it's not so cohesive after all. Sure, you get to see the Citadel in the background and you will eventually get there. You start to get accustomed and intrigued by CD17 during the first 3 chapters of the game, but after these first 3 chapters, you embark in an involuntary journey, since it's basically a misplacement from Kleiner's teleporter what justifies most of Half-Life 2 campaign. And thus you travel across swampy, sewer-like areas in Water Hazard, desolated sandy landscapes in Sandstorm, and arid coastal areas in Highway 17. These levels are kind of empty, and in my opinion they do not add anything to the lore of the game. You're just traveling across them, because you either need to get back to CD17 to reach Kleiner's lab, or you need to save the captured Eli Vance. There is an argument floating among the Half-Life community discussing how these more extensive levels were mostly made to showcase the Source engine power, and how great this iconic engine was in handling huge outdoor open areas, and they definitely still look impressive to this day, but at the same time this choice, in my opinion, watered down Half-Life 2 plot. My opinion on this type of Half-Life 2 levels, and the same applies to the episodes, is that they don't really help in giving Half-Life 2 a solid identity, which was already diluted by the huge gap and missing links between Half-Life 1 plot and Half-Life 2. Sure, Kleiner talks about the 7 Hours War, the Combine Uprising and the nuke back in Black Mesa, but contrary to Half-Life 1, in which you experience part of the backstory firsthand, in Half-Life 2 you get to see nothing of this. To me, these are just expedients invented by Valve to justify a fresh new start for the game. Episode 1 instead is very much focused on both CD17 and the Citadel, which is nice. It's like Valve understood Half-Life 2's core identity and built upon it, although the game is kind of unexciting due to some design choices, like fighting hordes of zombies or escorting rebels. With Episode 2 instead, again Valve decides to spice things up, marking another change in the environment. As we all know, Episode 2 takes place mostly in the White Forest and in the caves around that area, where the rebels organize and have found a safe haven. Unfortunately, everyone is aware of Episode 2 being the last Half-Life game to be released to this day. My explanation to this is that Valve didn't know anymore which direction to take, especially after all these shifts in set and setting. In addition to this, in Episode 2, Eli Vance and Kleiner hint at the Borealis. According to them, it's a ship of legendary status and they make a big fuss about it, even though the player never heard of it before. My interpretation to this is that the Borealis was introduced all of a sudden to justify a third episode or perhaps even Half-Life 3 unfolding on this cargo ship. However, I believe Valve did not push through with this idea because it was a risky choice to undertake. First of all, it's hard to create interesting level and graphic design inside a ship If Black Mesa felt claustrophobic for some, imagining a bunch of levels on a ship, but most importantly, a new Half-Life game taking place in another remote place on the globe would have fragmented Half-Life identity way too much. Moreover, the Borealis cutscene tries to establish links with the Portal series and Aperture Science.
At Aperture Science were at work on a project of some promise, but in their rush to beat Black Mesa for funding, they must have compromised ordinary standards of risk.
And if we take into consideration that both Portal 1 and Episode 2 were both released on the same date, 10 October 2007, this makes me think that Valve had some strange and confused ideas about the progression of the Half-Life series in the future. My argument is that Valve's biggest mistake was to drift away way too abruptly and harshly from Half-Life 1 original setting, Black Mesa. Black Mesa proved itself to be a very fertile ground for new games to come out. Plenty of great mods have been created, expanding on Half-Life lore in a non-canonic way, but most importantly, 2 great expansions were released in quick succession, a single year after the other. And they are stellar expansions as well. Opposing Force is definitely a masterpiece, and it only took 1 year to develop it. In addition to this, these games were not even developed by Valve, but by Gearbox Software, and they still managed to nail both the gameplay and the atmosphere of the original game, while expanding and adding new quirks to it. So yeah, I'm truly convinced that Valve was scared to fragment what used to be its most popular franchise, by creating a sequel located in a new, more detached area, far away from both CD17 and Black Mesa. Perhaps for a couple of years after Episode 2 release, they really tried to string a convincing plotline for Episode 3 or Half-Life 3, but they probably failed in their endeavors. Now let's move on to the second issue I had already profiled in the introduction to this video. Half-Life 2's focus on characters and emotions. If Half-Life 1 is completely devoid of any trace of emotions and rapport between characters, an aspect that, in my opinion, fits perfectly with its sci-fi theme, Half-Life 2 instead doubles down on building connections between characters and the player. In many occurrences, the game closes Gordon inside a room where a bunch of characters start having a conversation. They either reminisce about Black Mesa or argue amongst each other, which in turn displays their personalities. But what they enjoy doing the most is bossing Gordon around, by telling him what moves he should execute next. These sections are kind of weak, since Gordon cannot interact with others because he has chosen selective mutism. Anyway, my point is that while in Half-Life 1 the plot flowed naturally because of a strong premise and an hostile circumstance the player needs to escape from, in Half-Life 2 the plot moves on according on what Gordon is told to do. Alex wants to save his father, guess you gotta go. Even the rebels have the audacity to tell Freeman what to do, which is paradoxical.
Hey, Freeman, get back out there and help.
Not just Gordon is controlled by the main characters, but so is the plot, and Episode 2 definitely capitalizes on all the forced exposure to the characters that happened in the final part of Half-Life 2, where Alex either follows you or is in your ears giving unwanted advices, and in Episode 1, where she's strung along with you for the entire time. After having consolidated the rapports between Freeman and the characters, Episode 2 chooses to capitalize on emotions through anxiety-inducing scenes such as Alex being pierced by those surprisingly pointy hunter's legs. Naturally, the player starts worrying or rejoicing that he won't ever see or hear Alex speaking again, but then, with a sigh of relief, Gordon manages to revive her with the help of the Vortigons. However, the most excruciating moment of Episode 2 is certainly the final, where Eli is suddenly killed by a creepy advisor. This ending is a climax of sentimentalism. Hell, you can even hear Alex sobbing even after the screen has faded to black and the credits have almost begun rolling.
No. Oh my God. Dad. No. Don't leave me.
Exploiting emotions is definitely effective in keeping the player immersed into the game until the very last minute, and even I felt bad about Eli, although I had already played episode 2 before and I knew everything. However, I do not think it was wise to make the Half-Life series become so dependent onto the characters, because, first of all, writing good dialogues and developing each and every single character in a coherent way is an extra challenge by itself, but above all, you don't want to turn a masterpiece of a franchise into a soap opera, and you know how soap operas or even TV series, after a couple of seasons, begin to start rotting. This happens because managing different characters' interactions and inventing a new coherent experience every season or episodes gets harder for every new release. Perhaps Valve acknowledged this and thus decided to cut it short and not release any more games because they would have turned the plot into a big entangled mess. Eli is dead, Judith Mossman has recently been captured, Alex is swearing revenge, and Valve was probably already forced to make a third episode with Alex following you, just like in episode 1. In the long run, keeping tracks of all the characters is not sustainable in my opinion. It's very possible thus that the writers were burning themselves out trying to untangle the various knots of the already unstable Half-Life 2 plot, and as a consequence they just decided to scrap everything off. Take a look at this quote from a 2017 interview with Valve published on Game Informer. I've heard that some teams have had 2 to 3 people working on it and they eventually run into a wall, and some teams may have gotten up to 30 or 40 people before it was scrapped. Valve seemed to be very confused about the direction Half-Life 3 or Episode 3 should have taken. The following part of the interview reveals some crazy ways of thinking by some of Valve's employers, which I'm glad that nobody took seriously. They were thinking about using the Half-Life characters as a brand for entirely different purposes. Some were bizarre, like turning Half-Life into an RTS or a live-action choice-driven game. So, to make a small recap, my points on why we still haven't got a sequel to Episode 2 are the following. Confusion inside Valve's office complex, and perhaps even a small degree of insecurity on how to keep the franchise rolling. Fear of fragmenting Half-Life identity by introducing every time new different places and having to invent a convincing story to justify all these locations shift, and as a final point, a plot more interested in character dynamics rather than circumstances or events. Only God or Gabe knows when Half-Life 3 will come out, but in an interview with Edge, Gabe Newell makes an interesting remark about innovations in the single-player genre. The theory is essentially that AI could mean that the single-player games of the future will grow and evolve in a way that currently is only possible in games populated by big numbers of humans, MMOs, Battle Royales, games as service, and blah blah blah. So it seems that Gabe's mind is pointing towards very ambitious ideas involving AI to create a single-player world that unites the longevity and challenges of the multiplayer experience. Considering that during the decade of the 2010s, Valve became more of a multiplayer game company, with CSGO and Dota 2 spearheading the competitive online gaming landscape, perhaps Valve will really try and give a shot in unifying these two different modalities of playing games in the next Half-Life game. And so for this video, this is it guys. Are you waiting for Half-Life 3? Or have you buried all your hopes 7 feet underground? Let me know in the comments, and yeah, like and subscribe if you want to.